are the four players that the Indiana Fever should core to make sure that no team can touch them heading into the expansion draft. Remember, you just lose these players straight up. You don't get anything back for the players. They're gone. We didn't get anything for Temi, did we? No, exactly.
The Indiana Fever have been the talk of the town, dominating headlines and social media feeds alike. Everywhere you turn, their name is on people's lips. Sports bars buzz with debates about their future. Podcasts dissect every move. Twitter explodes after every game. But what if the real story isn't happening on the court? What if everything we've been watching, the wins, the losses, the spectacular plays, has been nothing more than a distraction from the real drama unfolding behind closed doors? Behind the highlight reels, post-game interviews, and carefully curated press conferences, whispers of a fractured locker room have grown into a roar that can no longer be ignored or dismissed as idle speculation. Now, with the sudden and calculated release of 4 players in rapid succession, it seems head coach Stephanie White has finally made her move, executing a plan that may have been months in the making. But was this about team building and strategic roster construction, the kind of tough decisions that championship organizations must make? Or was it a desperate attempt to regain control of a team teetering on the brink of complete collapse, a last-ditch effort to salvage a season that was slipping away? The basketball world has been watching with a mixture of fascination, concern, and morbid curiosity as the Fever's internal struggles have begun to spill into public view. What started as vague rumors whispered in arena corridors and unconfirmed reports from anonymous sources has evolved into a full-blown organizational crisis that threatens to derail what many believed would be a transformative season for the franchise. The question on everyone's mind is simple but profound. What really happened in Indianapolis? To understand the current crisis, we need to rewind. The Indiana Fever weren't always in this position. Just a few years ago, they were one of the league's premier franchises, a model of consistency and professionalism. Championship banners hung in their arena. Their fan base was loyal and passionate. But time is unforgiving in professional sports. And the Fever found themselves facing the reality that every organization eventually confronts. Rebuild or fade into irrelevance. The decision to bring in Stephanie White wasn't made lightly. The front office conducted extensive interviews, consulted with league insiders, and analyzed countless hours of film from her previous coaching stops. White came with an impressive resume, having succeeded at multiple levels of basketball. She understood the Indiana market, having played and coached in the state before. She was seen as someone who could restore the discipline and defensive identity that had once defined Fever basketball. At the same time, the franchise made another crucial decision, drafting generational talent. When Caitlin Clark's name was called on draft night, the arena erupted. Fans saw hope, the media saw headlines, and the front office saw dollar signs, jersey sales, ticket revenue, national television appearances. Clark represented everything modern basketball had become. Dynamic, creative, unorthodox, and utterly captivating to watch. But here's what nobody fully considered in those euphoric moments. What happens when you pair a coach who believes in structure with a player who thrives in chaos? What happens when you build a team around a superstar but hire a coach who doesn't believe in superstar treatment? The seeds of the current crisis were planted in those very decisions, seemingly smart moves that would later reveal themselves to be fundamentally incompatible. The signs of trouble were there if you knew where to look, subtle at first but growing more obvious with each passing week. Veteran reporters and league insiders, those who had covered the WNBA for years and developed a sense for when something wasn't right, had been picking up on subtle cues for weeks before the story broke into the mainstream. On the surface, to the casual observer watching games on television, it appeared to be just a team finding its footing, experiencing the natural growing pains that come with integrating new talent and adjusting to a new system. Every team goes through this, right? New players need time to learn the playbook. Chemistry doesn't develop overnight. Coaches need time to figure out rotations and understand their personnel. These are the reassurances that front offices give to concerned fans. The platitudes that fill post-game press conferences after disappointing losses. But those with access to the inner workings of the organization, those who attended practices and spoke with people close to the team, pointed to something far more troubling, a fundamental clash of styles and philosophies that was tearing at the fabric of the team. Stephanie White, a coach known throughout the basketball world for her tough, defensive-minded approach and no-nonsense demeanor, was now leading a team with some of the most dynamic offensive talents in the game. Her resume speaks to discipline, structure, and a grinding, possession-by-possession mentality that has served her well throughout her coaching career. She believes in defense first, in making the other team earn every point. She believes in offensive systems where every player knows their role and executes it precisely. She believes in hierarchy and respect for authority. But this wasn't just a difference in strategy or tactical preference, the kind of disagreement that could be resolved through compromise or adaptation. This was a battle for the very soul of the team, a philosophical war being waged in practice sessions and film rooms across Indianapolis. It was old school versus new school, structure versus freedom, experience versus innovation. And like all wars, this one would have casualties. The tension was palpable to anyone paying close attention. Body language during timeouts told a story of disconnect that words never could. Players would nod during defensive instructions, going through the motions of listening, but exchange glances during offensive sets, silent communications that spoke volumes. You could see it in the way certain players would sigh when a play was called. In the way others would shake their heads almost imperceptibly when a teammate took a shot that wasn't in the system. The energy on the bench during games fluctuated wildly, suggesting a team that was anything but unified. One moment, everyone would be up and cheering after a great defensive stop. Next half the bench would remain seated during an offensive highlight, offering only perfunctory applause. Veterans who had been in the league for years could see what was happening. They'd been on dysfunctional teams before and recognized the signs. Sources close to the organization began leaking stories of heated exchanges behind closed doors, of players forming opposing camps, of a coaching staff struggling to maintain authority. One source described a practice session where White stopped play repeatedly to correct offensive positioning, only to have a player snap back that the wrong positioning had led to an open shot. Another described a film session where the room was divided literally and figuratively, with some players sitting in the front rows nodding along with White's points, while others sat in the back, arms crossed, clearly disengaged. The front office tried to contain the situation, having private meetings with key players, bringing in sports psychologists to address team dynamics, even consulting with other coaches around the league about how to handle strong personalities. But like water finding cracks in a dam, the truth had a way of seeping out. It was only a matter of time before something had to give, before the pressure building beneath the surface erupted into public view in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. As the season progressed, the internal tensions began manifesting in ways that couldn't be hidden. The Fever's performance on the court became increasingly inconsistent, swinging wildly between dominant victories and inexplicable losses. One night, they would look like a legitimate championship contender, their defense suffocating opponents and their offense clicking with precision. Next, they would struggle against teams they should easily beat, looking disorganized and unmotivated. Post-game interviews became exercises in reading between the lines. White would talk about commitment to the system and doing things the right way, barely concealed code for her frustration with players who weren't buying in. Players would offer carefully worded responses about still figuring things out and learning to play together. Diplomatic language that masked deeper frustrations. The media began to pick up on the subtext, asking increasingly pointed questions about team chemistry and coaching philosophy. Social media became a battlefield where the conflict played out in subtle ways. Players who once regularly interacted online suddenly stopped liking each other's posts. Some players would share motivational quotes about staying true to yourself or not letting others dim your light, messages that seemed directed at someone or something specific. Fans began noticing these patterns, creating detailed threads analyzing who was in whose social circle, who attended whose events, who seemed genuinely happy, and who seemed to be going through the motions. Behind the scenes, according to multiple sources who spoke on condition of anonymity, the divide was becoming impossible to ignore. Team meetings grew tense and unproductive. White would present game plans that emphasized defensive stops and controlled offense, while certain players would advocate for a more up-tempo, freedom-based approach. Neither side was willing to fully compromise, each believing its way was the path to success. The coaching staff itself was reportedly split. Assistant coaches who had come with White were loyal to her vision, backing her defensive schemes and structured approach. But other assistants, particularly those who had been with the organization longer, privately expressed concerns that the system wasn't maximizing the team's offensive talent. These internal divisions among the coaches only made the situation worse, as players picked up on the lack of unified messaging. Practice sessions became increasingly uncomfortable. Drills that should have been routine became contentious. White would design practices heavily focused on defensive positioning and rotations, spending hours on scenarios that some players felt were overcoached and stifling. When the team would scrimmage, the games would often devolve into showcases for individual talent rather than team play, as certain players seemed determined to prove that their freestyle approach could work. The front office found itself in an impossible position. They had invested heavily in both White and their star players. They couldn't simply fire a coach they had just hired, nor could they trade away the talents they had built the franchise around. So they tried to thread the needle, having separate meetings with White and key players, attempting to mediate and find common ground. But mediation only works when both parties want to find a solution, and increasingly, it seemed like both sides had dug in, unwilling to budge from their positions. Veteran players who had been through similar situations before began to worry openly, though quietly, about where this was headed. They had seen teams' critic of the team's direction in White's coaching methods. They hadn't kept their concerns private, hadn't whispered them, only to close friends. They had spoken up in team meetings, questioning strategies they viewed as outdated and rigid. According to sources within the organization, who spoke on condition of anonymity, this player had become increasingly vocal in team meetings, questioning defensive schemes that seemed to stifle the team's offensive creativity. They had allegedly become a voice for others who felt similarly constrained but were afraid to speak up, essentially acting as a spokesperson for a growing faction of dissent. In private conversations with teammates, they had reportedly said things like, "This isn't how modern basketball works anymore, and we're wasting talent trying to play a system from 20 years ago." The release was a classic power play, a warning shot fired across the bow of a divided locker room. It was White's way of demonstrating that criticism would not be tolerated, that her authority was absolute, and that loyalty to her system was non-negotiable. The message was clear. It didn't matter how well you played, how popular you were with fans, or how long you'd been with the organization. If you challenged the coach's vision, you were expendable. The timing of this first move was particularly significant. It came not during the chaos of the season's start, or at a natural breaking point like the All-Star break, but seemingly out of nowhere, catching even seasoned observers off guard. This suggested that White and the front office had been planning their response, watching and waiting, documenting instances of dissent and building a case. They had been patient, strategic, letting the dissenting voices feel comfortable enough to fully reveal themselves before striking. The reaction within the locker room was reportedly one of shock and fear. Players who had been friends with the released player were devastated, some openly crying when they heard the news. But more than sadness, there was fear. If this player could be released, anyone could be. It didn't matter anymore about talent or production or relationships within the organization. The only thing that mattered was compliance. Some players reached out privately to the released player, offering support and expressing confusion about the decision. Others, whether out of self-preservation or genuine agreement with the move, publicly backed the organization's decision, posting on social media about trusting the process and staying focused on the team's goals. These public displays of loyalty were noted by everyone, marking those players as firmly in White's camp. The media coverage of the release was extensive but ultimately superficial. Without access to the real reasons behind the move, reporters fell back on speculation and analysis of the players' statistics, debating whether their production justified a roster spot. But those paying closer attention understood that statistics were irrelevant here. This was about power, control, and sending a message. And the message had been received loud and clear. Soon after, in moves that felt almost choreographed in their timing, 2 more players were shown the door in quick succession. The second release came just 3 days after the first. Barely enough time for the initial shock to wear off. The third came less than a week after that. On their own, these roster moves might have been overlooked as typical mid-season adjustments or the kind of roster tinkering that every team engages in when things aren't working. Teams released players all the time. It's part of the business. Sometimes a player just doesn't fit the system. Sometimes their role becomes redundant when another player steps up. Sometimes there are financial considerations or plans to sign someone else. In isolation, any of these moves could have been explained away, rationalized as unfortunate but necessary business decisions. But together, viewed as part of a larger pattern, they painted a picture of something far more deliberate and concerning. This was a coach systematically dismantling a faction of dissent, methodically removing voices that challenged her authority. It was targeted, calculated, and ruthlessly efficient. White wasn't just making roster adjustments. She was performing a purge, eliminating anyone she viewed as a threat to her control. Whispers of cliques and a fractured team chemistry had plagued the Fever for weeks leading up to these moves. Players were reportedly sitting at different tables during team meals. A classic sign of a divided locker room. The veterans sat together at one table, the rookies at another, and the star players at yet another. But the real division wasn't about age or